Howdy, folks. Today is the Feast of the Ascension, and I thought I'd do a live stream in honor of that. One of the things that I think characterizes the Feast of the Ascension is it's mysterious, obviously. It's also somewhat underestimated. It has an importance, particularly for apologetics, that usually is not understood or appreciated. So I want to talk about that. But first I want to talk about what the Ascension means for us. Now, obviously, the Ascension is what occurs at the end of Jesus's earthly ministry, where he ascends into heaven, and that shows us he's going back to be with God. That's the fundamental message of the Ascension, that Jesus is now with God, and then eventually he'll return and at the second coming and renovate the earth and raise the dead and judge the living and the dead and so forth. But right now he's with God, and the Ascension shows us that because he's not here anymore. He ascended into heaven. But there's something strange about that from a modern point of view. Today, we're aware that God is not in outer space. You know, if you were to ascend and keep ascending from the surface of the earth, eventually you'd get out of the atmosphere and you'd be in the solar system, and eventually, like the Voyager probe, you'd leave the solar system and be heading towards another star. But no matter how far you go in the physical universe, you wouldn't arrive at where God is, because God is not in any particular physical place. He's omnipresent, so he's everywhere in a certain sense, but he's not localized the way we are. And that means that there's something a little interesting going on with the Ascension. I mean, why would God choose to have Jesus ascend? Now, Jesus, of course, is not sailing through space. He ascended, and according to the book of Acts, sight of him was lost when he was cut off by a cloud. Presumably after that point, he just left our material universe altogether, perhaps by just disappearing, phasing out. And if he did that, well, why couldn't he have done that just standing on earth? I mean, it's within the power of divine omnipotence. So Jesus, talking to the disciples on the Mount of Olives, could have just faded out of view or just winked out in an instant. And he could have done that. Presumably the reason he didn't do that is to show us that he's going to be with God in a more dramatic way. And we think about God as being in heaven, even though he's not literally in outer space. We still think about God as being up from our perspective. And so it was natural for Jesus to use that fact about human psychology to show us that he's going to be with God. But that then raises a deeper question. Why do we think about God being up? Well, if you look at different world religions, when people imagine where the gods are, they always imagine them being somewhere. And that's because we, as human beings, when we relate to someone, we're always relating to someone who's occupying a physical place. So we think about the person we're talking to in front of us, or if they're behind us, we think about them being behind us, or if they're, up on a ledge or something, we think about them being up on a ledge, or down, if they're down, in a hole in the ground. We always think about people we're relating to being somewhere. And it's therefore natural when we're thinking about invisible beings like angels or spirits or God to imagine them being somewhere. And in different world religions, people always imagine the gods being somewhere, and they imagine them being in particular places. In certain religions, like the Greco-Roman religion or the Egyptian religion, there were deities that lived underground. They're called chthonic deities. There would also be deities that lived underwater, like Poseidon, the Greek god of the ocean. Then there would be gods who lived on mountains, like the main Greek pantheon. They lived up on Mount Olympus. And sometimes they'd be visualized as just being straight up in the sky. So you have gods in these locations, underground, underwater, on a mountaintop, in the sky. What do all those locations have in common? Well, one thing is they're all places people normally aren't. We live on the surface of the earth. Now, we maybe can climb up to a mountaintop, but we have to expend effort to get there, and we don't tend to live right up on a mountaintop. We spend most of our time, down on the ground, or at least at lower elevations. And so it's natural for people to imagine the gods being in locations that are inaccessible to humans, that we don't spend a lot of time in, precisely because the gods and other spirits are not visible to us. We don't see them walking around the street. And so it's natural to imagine them being in these inaccessible places. So if that's a native human tendency that's true in all different kinds of culture, why do we Christians and our Jewish brethren who had this image before us, why do we imagine the true God as being up? Why not some other direction? Why not underground or underwater or even just on a mountaintop? Why do we imagine God being in the sky? Well, that goes back to another of the very interesting facts about human nature. If you study human language and human culture, one of the things you find is a human universal is we have a symbol that we use instinctively in our psychology that equates up with goodness, with things that are better, with things that are superior, with things that in one way or another are good. And the reason for that is probably connected with the fact that we walk upright and the way our bodies are built. We're vertically oriented beings. So that's why we walk upright. If we were quadrupeds, then we might think of front as good as opposed to up, but we're vertical beings, and so we think of up as good. And that's connected with the fact that our eyes, we're very visual creatures, and our eyes are at the top of our heads, and our arms that we interact with things with more than any other part of our body, physical interaction, those are also towards the top of our bodies. And so between our eyes and our hands and the fact that we walk upright, it's natural for us to associate up with superior things, with good things, because they're easier for us to see and interact with, and so forth. And we actually have a tendency to map, this is something that cognitive scientists have discovered, we have a tendency to map the world onto our bodies and use the axes of our bodies as a way of navigating the world. And since we have a preferential option for faces and for our heads, and those are at the top of our bodies, that also feeds into the up equals good metaphor. And so if you're a Jew or a Christian and you believe in there's one true God, and there are other created spirits, but there's one uncreated and true God. And if we're going to imagine him being somewhere so we can relate to him, we want to imagine him in the best place. And based on the way we're designed as human beings, we're going to imagine him as being up. And so that's why we imagine God being in the sky, even though we know that's literally not true. And that then is why at the Ascension, when Jesus wanted to communicate to us that he's going to be with the Father, he's with the Father now, that's why he chose to ascend vertically from the surface of the earth as a symbol of his going to be with God, even though he then at some point ceased to be in our world at all. So that helps us understand why he did this. It helps us understand both what message he was trying to communicate and how the way he communicated it is rooted in human nature. Now, I mentioned that the Ascension has a value for apologetics that's not often appreciated. And I want to talk about that. As far as I'm aware, this is an insight that I'm not aware of anyone else using, but it's one I've had for a long time, and I've used it in some of my writings. Like if you look at my book, A Daily Defense, I make a point of this. But here's what it is. The Ascension, oftentimes when people focus on Christian apologetics and they want to prove the Christian faith, offer evidence for the Christian faith, they point to the resurrection of Jesus. And they will point out problems with alternative theories to the resurrection. Like, for example, some have proposed, well, Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. The disciples just went to the wrong tomb. Or Jesus just swooned on the cross. He became unconscious, and then later he revived in the tomb, but he didn't really rise from the dead. He wasn't dead. So there are these alternative theories that skeptics have proposed for the resurrection, and in dealing with them, apologists have pointed out problems with those. But you can strengthen your argument for the resurrection if you take note of the Ascension, because the early Christians didn't just claim that Jesus rose from the dead. They also claimed that he ascended into heaven. And in fact, that was part of the Christian message right from the beginning. That was the explanation for why he's not here on earth, why you couldn't just go meet Jesus somewhere. It's because he's in heaven now, and we're waiting for him to come back. So the return of Jesus, which was clearly part of the Christian message right from the beginning, and the explanation for why you can't just go meet him physically today, all of that is rooted directly in the Ascension. So we know this was a vital part of the Christian message right from the beginning. They didn't just proclaim the resurrection, they also proclaimed the Ascension and then the future second coming. So if we know that the early Christians proclaimed these two things in particular, the resurrection and the Ascension, what implications does that have for some of the alternative theories to the resurrection? Well, suppose the disciples went to the wrong tomb. Well, it's often been pointed out that that wouldn't explain why they then claimed to see him alive again, and it wouldn't explain why the Jewish authorities didn't simply go to the tomb and show it wasn't empty, but it also doesn't explain why they reported the Ascension, because corpses in tombs don't ascend into heaven. And they claimed, we saw this, he ascended into heaven. So you get an additional problem with the wrong tomb theory if you take note of the Ascension. You also get an additional argument when dealing with the swoon theory, because the swoon theory at least explains the empty tomb. And it explains in some way the post-resurrection appearances, because if Jesus swooned on the cross and then revived in the tomb and then somehow got out of the tomb, and there are problems there, but if he somehow got out of the tomb, then the tomb would be empty and he could appear to people. I mean, he could interact with them. But it wouldn't explain the Ascension, because if you're just an ordinary person and you were tortured and became unconscious and then later revived, that doesn't give you the ability to fly. So the report of the Ascension still reveals an inadequacy with the swoon hypothesis in explaining the empty tomb, and it does the same thing with others. I'll just give you one more example with other alternatives to the resurrection, like the twin hypothesis, the idea that Jesus had a twin. And now there's no evidence for that, and the odds are very low, and there's a bunch of problems with it. Among them, well, the tomb still wouldn't be empty. It could potentially explain why the disciples thought they saw Jesus after the crucifixion, but it still wouldn't explain the Ascension, because unless you have an active meta gene and you're a mutant, if you're an ordinary human being, you can't fly. So even though if Jesus did have a twin, it might explain some of what the apostles saw, like him eating in front of them after the resurrection. It wouldn't explain how they saw him ascend into heaven. And so the Ascension is a very, to my mind, underappreciated event, both in terms of understanding what it means and in terms of understanding why God chose to do it that way, and in terms of its value for apologetics. So in what remains of the Feast of the Ascension today, I hope you'll bear that all in mind. Having said that, let me take some questions. I'm going to scroll up and see what questions we have. Ryan says, why do we refer to Mary as being assumed into heaven instead of having ascended to heaven? The answer is because she didn't do it under her own power. When Mary or other saints like Elijah, for example, were assumed into heaven, they were taken up by God, and that's what assume means. I mean, today we tend to think of assuming things as a mental process, and that's another thing you'll note about it. Again, we're using what's really at its root a physical metaphor to describe a mental phenomenon when we talk about making assumptions. But physically, to assume something is to take it up. And so since Mary, being a human being in a non-glorified state, didn't have the power to be assumed into heaven, or didn't have the power to go to heaven on her own, God assumed her, used his miraculous power to bring her to heaven. And that's different than what happened in Jesus' case. In Jesus' case, being God, he has the power to ascend into heaven. Ascend is something that if we ascend a staircase, for example, we do that under our own power. Or if we ascend a ladder, we do that under our own power. And so since Jesus had the power to go to heaven on his own without anyone else's help, because he's omnipotent, we use ascend when we talk about Jesus going to heaven. Because Mary didn't have that power, we refer to her being assumed. Now, I should note, in case anybody wonders, all three persons of the Trinity cooperate in every act that occurs outside of the Trinity. So actually the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all three cooperated in Jesus ascending into heaven. But still, Jesus has the omnipotence, and he did use his own omnipotence, his own power, in going to heaven. And so it still makes the term ascend appropriate. Let's see. Rebecca says, could you talk about the Ascension as it relates in light of what you're saying about the physical nature of the event to Elijah's ascension via chariots of fire? Well, so the Elijah event is similar in that Elijah ceases to be on earth, and that happens by him going up into heaven. This event is described as in connection with a chariot of fire. It's also described in connection with a whirlwind. It's something like Mary's assumption that Elijah did not have the power to do on his own, and so it would be normal to talk about Elijah being assumed into heaven rather than ascending into heaven. But we're not given a huge amount of detail about the Elijah event. It happens pretty quickly in the Old Testament, and afterwards, we're given more detail leading up to the event and then after it, because Elijah knew this was going to happen and talked about it with his understudy Elisha, which some people want to say Elisha, but actually if you wanted to say it Hebrew style, it would be Elisha. which to me sounds better than Elisha. But anyway, he talked about it with Elisha beforehand, and then afterwards we track Elisha's movements after that event. And some people proposed at the time that that maybe God had just taken Elijah up in a whirlwind and then set him down somewhere else. But of course that's not the case. But what that suggestion tells us is, again, like when Jesus ascended into heaven, God used the going up, the physical act of going up, as a kind of enacted metaphor for going to be with God, which is really ultimately what happens here. Elijah ends up with God the same way Jesus ends up with God and the way Mary ends up with God. Bao says, regarding Eucharistic adoration, the main use of the Eucharist is to have communion in the church. Are we taking the Eucharist out of its intended context? I assume you mean by Eucharistic adoration. Well, it's true that Jesus gave us the Eucharist for purposes of communion, and we shouldn't simply take the Eucharist and never consume it. But there is, of necessity, a gap of time between when the consecration occurs and when we receive communion. I mean, even if it's a very brief time, there is still that gap. And there was that gap on the night of the Last Supper when Jesus said the first Mass. So knowing that there's a gap just because of the need, I mean, even if you're the priest and even if you consecrated, you still need to take the Eucharist and retrieve it and put it in your mouth, and that's going to take some time. But because of our awareness of the fact that this is now Jesus, this is now God, it's natural for us to pause and think about that fact and worship Him. And that insight that it's okay to pause and reflect. You don't have to immediately gobble as soon as transubstantiation has occurred. The goal is not to get the Eucharist into your mouth as fast as possible. The goal is to do this in a way that reveres Jesus. And so it's natural to do it in a slower, more recollected way that gives us the opportunity to adore Him before we receive Him. And in fact, in the liturgy, after the consecration, after the consecration of each element, there's a moment where we do pause to adore the Eucharist as a group, in addition to whatever private adoration we may make as well. And so it's natural to take time to adore the Eucharist. You don't have to immediately consume it. And so that raises the question, how long can you do this? And there's no set limit. He didn't say, oh, by the way, you have to do this within 15 minutes or within 20 minutes or anything like that. And as long as the elements are consumed before they would corrupt, it's okay to receive communion later. And in fact, that's a practice that started in the early church. Sometimes, because of persecution, Christians couldn't always meet together, and so they would consecrate the Eucharist at Mass and then store the Eucharist, reserve it, so that they could receive communion later if they couldn't have another Mass. Also, some people would be sick and they couldn't make it to Mass, and so some of the Eucharist would be reserved so it could be taken to the sick. And in the West, it became common to build tabernacles, special structures to protect the Eucharist while it was being reserved, such as for the sick. And then eventually people said, that's still Jesus in there, in the tabernacle. We ought to take some time right now to adore Him. And so it became natural to have Eucharistic adoration and eventually Eucharistic exposition. And so you can see how these practices are a natural outgrowth of the fact that we don't have to gobble the Eucharist immediately. There's not that kind of urgency. As long as we don't let the elements corrupt, it's okay to have them around and to continue to adore Jesus. And in a way, that's just an extension of why he gave us the Eucharist to begin with. It was a way of being with us, of being close to us, and this simply extends that. So it's not taking the Eucharist and using it for some purpose that it wasn't meant to have. It's just a way of continuing to adore Jesus before that same host is eventually consumed. It just extends the natural process. So, hope that helps you out. Let's see. I'm going to try to keep this one short today, so I think I'll take one more question. Adrian, and this is another appropriate one for today. Adrian says, I've heard that heaven isn't a place, that it's a state. Can you clarify this? Is it one or the other or both or something else? Well, the essence of heaven. Now, the term heaven can be used in different senses. I guess that's a good starting point for answering the question. Originally, the term heaven just meant the sky, and that's the original sense. And as I talked about earlier in this live stream, that began to be used metaphorically as a reference to where God is. And really, God isn't anywhere in particular. In a sense, he's no place. He has no physical location. In another sense, he's everywhere. He's omnipresent. But in his essence, in his divine essence, he doesn't have any dimensions. And so he's not extended in space and time the way a physical object is. And that means that if you define heaven as just where God is, it has no coordinates in space or time. It's in an eternal now outside of space and time that's dimensionless. There's no height, no width, no depth, no fourth dimension, no time, no anything else. It's dimensionless. So that's the heaven where God is, understood in a more literal sense. But over time, there became, and this was actually pretty early, but there became an awareness of an additional sense of heaven that's kind of in the middle. It's not the sky, but it's not the dimensionless eternity where God is. It's in the middle. And that heaven is where the angels are and where human souls go. And so it's a state of spiritual union with God, at least the souls of the blessed. It's a state of spiritual union with God, and that's the fundamental characteristic of this understanding of heaven. It's a state of spiritual union with God. Now, does it have dimensions? Well, if the essence of this understanding of heaven, union with God, if that's how we're understanding heaven in this sense of the term, then you don't need dimensions on God's part, but you do on ours. Because created beings always, at a minimum, require time. This is something that people sometimes get confused about, and they think, well, because God's in an eternal now outside of time, we're going to be too. No. The Church's understanding is every creature is bound by time. Even if it's not time the way we experience it here, we still are all and always will be characterized by time. So we're not eternal in the sense of being atemporal or outside of time. We're eternal in the sense of being everlasting. Our souls will continue to exist through all eternity, through time. And so even though someone may be in heaven in the sense of now being in spiritual union with God, they need time to occupy. Otherwise, they'd cease to exist as a creature. What about space? Space just being another set of dimensions in addition to time? Well, even though it may not be located anywhere in our physical universe, it would seem that heaven is at least, in this middle sense, is at least capable of receiving a physical body. It may not be extended the same way that it was in our life, but it seems to be able to receive physical bodies because people like Elijah and Mary and Jesus all have their bodies with them in heaven. And so heaven seems to be a place that can, in the sense that it has time and, in some form, and it can at least receive bodies that are normally extended in space. So it seems to me you can think of it as a place, even if it has dimensions, even if they don't manifest the way the dimensions of our physical universe manifest, and even if you can't map the location of this place onto any location in our physical universe. So I would say that it's in some sense a place, even though its essence is the state of spiritual union with God. While you're in that state, your soul still needs to be somewhere in space and time, or at least in time, and then once you have your body, or for those who do have their bodies, in some kind of space as well. Once the resurrection of the dead occurs, Scripture speaks of heaven and earth being united, of being together. And it depicts, in the book of Revelation, depicts the city of God, where God dwells, coming out of heaven onto the new earth, and the two being united again. That's something else you find when you look at actually a lot of different world religions. Their belief system incorporates the idea that originally heaven and earth were united, and then they were separated. And to my mind, that's a memory of the fall of man, because originally God and man were in union, but then the fall separated us, and then via the redemption, we're being brought back together, which will be the final state of creation, where God and man are together again. And so once that happens, that state's clearly depicted as being a physical state in either a new universe or a renovated version of this universe. And so once that happens, we'll have heaven and earth at the same time. And so heaven will be occurring in a physical place, namely the new earth. So interesting stuff to think about and interesting stuff to look forward to. And we've had some great questions today, all of which nicely related in one way or another to the theme of the Ascension. So I want to thank you for being with me and hope you have a great rest of the Ascension, and I'll talk to you soon.